Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to the Justice for Journalists Foundation for supporting this event. It's an important discussion about abusive lawsuits being used against journalists and activists to silence criticism, which is important in terms of the public's right to know. We have an incredible group of people with us today to discuss this topic, but first we will start with a message from European Parliament President Roberta Metsola.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to address this important conference. The issue of media freedom is one that is particularly close to my heart, because the ability for journalists to report freely on matters of public interest is not just important, but essential to any democracy. Of course, having legitimate legal recourse to remedy any damages inflicted upon a person is also imperative to a functioning democracy. As a lawyer, I understand that well, but let me be clear. Strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPPs as we call them, are anything but legitimate. They are unfounded and abusive lawsuits that seek to muzzle journalists and provide a chilling effect on public participation. They do this by financially and emotionally draining their targets, starting out with threats and continuing with legal action. And trends have shown a worrying increase of these kinds of lawsuits within the last years. Few know this better than Caroline Muscat of The Shift. That is why the European Parliament is championing a new law that aims to protect journalists, activists, academics, artists and researchers from legal actions intended to silence them. I wish we did not have to do this, but I am proud of this Parliament's tenacity, because it is thanks to this House that we have a proposal for a SLAPP directive on the table. Currently, interinstitutional negotiations are underway between the European Parliament and the Council. Our aim is to ensure that this new law includes securities, fast-tracked procedures for compensation of harm, early dismissals in unfounded cases, and a reverse burden of proof. Apart from that, the European Parliament is calling for the creation of one-stop shops in member states so that victims of SLAPPs can receive the support they need, as well as EU and national public registries to show the dimension of the problem. My hope is that an agreement on this directive will soon be found, and before the end of this legislative term. Because this is important. It is important for democracy. It is important for those of you who have felt pursued, financially and emotionally drained, and sometimes left alone. And it is important in honour of Daphne Caruana Galizia's legacy. Your colleague and our friend, who was targeted with more than 40 pending lawsuits against her when she was cruelly murdered 6 years ago. A despicable act that inspired the pan-European anti-SLAPP movement and the Daphne law that we are working on today. Let me assure you of the European Parliament's and my own continued support on this issue. I thank you once again for this opportunity, and I wish you all a fruitful conference ahead.
A strong message from Dr. Metsola. We decided to organize this event today because the Shift has been on the front line in fighting back attempts to shut us down over the last 6 years through various SLAPPs. We are a small newsroom dedicated to investigative journalism, and we are committed to our task, that of holding power to account without fear or favor. For doing our job, we are paying a high price. The first SLAPP threat we received was only 3 weeks after our launch. It was from the global firm engaged by the Maltese government to sell passports, Henley & Partners. It was followed by another 4 in the last 5 years. And currently, the Shift is fighting 40 cases, legal challenges filed against us. This time, they were all filed by government ministries and agencies. These have already taken 2 years of our time, energy, and resources that we should spend on doing our job in the public interest. These lawsuits are abusive because the scope is not whether a journalist can be found guilty. They are often filed against robust investigations backed by strong evidence. The point is to put journalists under pressure, draining their time, energy, and money, and to make an example of them to discourage others from taking the same line in their work. The use of SLAPPs is indeed increasing, as Dr. Metsola said. A report by the coalition CASE shows that out of 47 European countries, Malta has the highest number of SLAPPs per capita. We have representatives from CASE here to explain the findings. The study shows the most common type of SLAPP offenders were business people, followed by politicians and state-owned entities. We at the Shift certainly know this to be true. We've been through the whole cycle. And the Shift is not the only independent newsroom in Malta to have faced SLAPPs. A total of 44 new cases were recorded in Malta last year alone, compared to 4 the previous year. 40 of those 44 cases last year are against the Shift. Last year, there was the highest annual number of SLAPPs since 2017, when 33 lawsuits were filed against Daphne Caruana Galizia. At the time of her assassination, she faced over 40 cases her family has unjustly inherited. With her bank accounts frozen, she also faced a $40 million lawsuit in Arizona by the owner of the now defunct Pilatus Bank. SLAPPs intend to force people with less power and resources into a court case, or several of them, hoping to crush them under the weight and expense of it. When all these cases were filed against the Shift, we had to raise some 40,000 euros within a few days, as the government launched some 80 lawyers against a single newsroom, all paid by taxpayers, while we struggled to survive. It is thanks to the financial support from our readers, international press freedom organizations, and lawyers who offer their time pro bono that we are still here today. The European Parliament and the European Commission have realized SLAPPs are a real problem, but a process to implement laws to safeguard journalists is still being debated 5 years later. In the meantime, SLAPP offenders have found new laws, new tools to use to silence criticism, to make sure you don't get to know what you need to know to make informed decisions. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without this, not only can't you have journalism, you can't have democracy. You can't have rule of law without the facts. And as the laws that should protect us are weaponized, you are getting less and less of those facts. But this conference is a message that the free press will not be silenced, even in times of crisis. Together, we can make sure that purpose is fulfilled. So let's start. I'll start by introducing our panelists. Maria, Director of Justice for Journalists Foundation, which is funding this conference. She's a risk assessment specialist who has designed and managed a number of public awareness, advocacy, human rights, and crisis management campaigns. Charlie Holt, Legal Counsel, Campaigns for Greenpeace. Charlie is currently focusing on building resilience against SLAPPs in Europe through the new coalition against SLAPPs, CASE. Keelan Gallagher, KC, from Doughty Street Chambers in the UK. Keelan is an international human rights lawyer. She has acted in many landmark cases on a wide range of human rights issues in the UK and internationally over the past 20 years. Eve Borch-Costanzi. Eve specializes in human rights and constitutional law, in which field she has represented several clients before the European Court of Human Rights. She is a member of the Council of Europe's Committee of Experts on SLAPPs. MEP David Casa needs no introduction. He is the longest-serving MEP from Malta and co-chair of the Media Working Group of the European Parliament. He has been active in pushing for a law to protect journalists from SLAPPs. So, welcome. Maria, I'll start with you. The Justice for Journalists Foundation has been supporting a number of these conferences in Europe and in the UK. It's been very focused. What are the outcomes from these conferences, and what are the legal challenges ahead of us?
Thank you, Carolyn. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today in Malta. This is my not my first time here. First time I came in 2019, and that was for the presentation of the book, the first book that was published and investigated Daphne's murder. That was one of our first supported by us, the project supported by the Justice for Journalists Foundation, because at that time we found out that the amount of cases when the journalists are facing lawsuits that prevent them from working and that prevent us, the audience, from getting the truth is so big that indeed our mission should have been a little bit shifted to help the journalists facing those lawsuits and to bring the public awareness to the issue of the SLAPPs. Our foundation initially was found to help investigate crimes against the media, but so that was 5 years ago. And when we looked through the pile of applications for our first grant program, we realized that a few of those were dedicated to the SLAPP issue. And we didn't even know what SLAPP was, and we realized that not a lot of people do. So we understood that at that point, looking at the cases from diverse places like Colombia, Ecuador, Malta, Armenia, UK, all sorts of places, the situation with SLAPPs was eerily similar. The journalists were facing this sort of attacks in all places, in all sorts of countries, democratic and not. So we realized that we need to support the topic, we need to help raise awareness, and that we had dedicated about 15% actually of our grant program over the last 5 years to support conferences like that, projects investigating the use of SLAPPs against media, support to the international media freedom organizations, and we believe it did bring an impact. We believe that resulting recommendations and resulting draft laws that are being now sort of considered by the European Commission, by the European Parliament, and in a few countries like the UK, for example, and that will be discussed further today, I'm sure. This is an indirect result of the support that we brought in terms of raising awareness to the SLAPPs issue.
Do you find support from other organizations?
I think we were one of the first, but now there are organizations that are supporting this issue, and we think it's very important that they continue to do so, because obviously in the situation when media freedom faces so many challenges, it is hard to put the priorities right, but SLAPPs do remain a problem, and they will remain a problem, and they're changing. The offenders obviously look for other ways of abusing the laws in order to silence the journalists, so that needs to be to remain one of the top priorities for the organizations, the donors.
I'll turn to Keelan. When we met at the International Journalism Festival in Perugia earlier this year, you spoke about lawfare. What does it mean and what does it signify?
Thanks, Caroline. And I want to cover 4 things today, outlining lawfare. I want to first of all cover what lawfare is, the phenomenon, how states are using it, wielding laws to shut down journalists, and indeed how powerful third-party actors are also using it. Secondly, how difficult it is to defend yourself against these kind of attacks as a journalist. Third, I want to take some lessons from the world of warfare and look at what states are really doing here. And fourth, I want to think about, at very high level at this stage of the conference, what we can do in terms of fighting back and taking some lessons ourselves. But before I do that, may I just say what a privilege it is to speak following 3 such brilliant women. We have just heard, of course, from the President of the European Parliament, who's doing such incredible work to protect journalists and in dealing with this phenomenon, from Caroline Muscat, who does such tremendous work here in extremely difficult circumstances and is inspirational to many of us working in this field, and Maria, who single-handedly and also with her brilliant organisation, including others who are here, has been doing so much to protect journalists and help journalists to fight back. And there's, of course, a fourth woman who's not with us today, but who is very much present, I think, for so many of us. And that's Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was, of course, a courageous woman, a brilliant journalist, who used her skills to speak truth to power in the same way that Caroline is doing, served the public good, believing in the power of journalism to build a more just society. And despite herself, she became the symbol of threats against journalists when she was brutally killed a number of years ago here in Malta. So she's very much present, I know, while we're having these discussions. So first of all, the phenomenon of lawfare. We now, of course, live in a world in which journalists face a very, very wide range of threats. The risks against journalists are manifold and multiple, and many of those threats are legal ones. And those legal threats are often diverse and multiple, and often come at journalists at the same time. And often, lawfare tends to signify a culture of impunity in the state in which it's operating. Now, we heard about the number of cases Daphne was facing at the time of her death, SLAPP's cases, so 48, 43 civil, 5 criminal cases. And this was a single freelancer who was facing all of those. It's like that old fairground game of whack-a-mole. She's having to face multiple different lawsuits at the same time as trying to do her job. And of course, in the same way that you've heard about Caroline and what the Shift has been doing, facing 40 different lawsuits brought by state entities challenging their freedom of information work, that again is attritional. It drains your resources, drains your resolve, and ultimately tries to prevent a journalist from doing what they do best, journalism, so reporting, doing investigations and doing their work. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in my work over the last number of years is some new trends in lawfare, the weaponisation of law against journalists. So I just want to tell you about a few of those. I'm increasingly seeing not only traditional legal weapons being used against journalists, so not just things like defamation laws, for example, but also counter-terrorism laws being used against journalists, and also very creative use of other laws, so regulatory laws, for example, intellectual property laws, and so on. I'll give you one example of it. In Turkey, Bloomsburg journalists were prosecuted under the Capital Markets Act because they had written, this was financial journalism, where they'd written a piece which related to the currency, and the argument by the state was, well, you're undermining state security by criticising our currency. So they were prosecuted for financial journalism. Now, lawyers who work for media organisations and media organisations have been trained in thinking about defamation laws, but they haven't been trained generally in thinking about capital market laws and how to deal with threats that come from unexpected legal quarters. Often what I'm seeing also is an aim to discredit the journalist, so trying to target the messenger, not just the message. I'll give you a few examples. My client Maria Ressa in the Philippines, who won the Nobel Peace Prize a number of years ago for her journalism, along with Dmitry Muratov from Russia. And Maria Ressa has not just been prosecuted using cyber libel, defamation type laws, she's also been prosecuted for tax evasion in completely sham charges, which are designed to send a message to the Philippines and to the world that this woman cannot be trusted. That's the same technique which is used against my client Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. It's the same technique which is used against Mir Shakil or Rahman, who heads GeoTV in Pakistan. It's the same technique used against Rana Ayub in India. So this is now a new technique where journalists are presented as being fraudsters, tax evaders, dishonest. And that's supposed to have two effects. It's supposed to both damage the journalist, but also lead the public to think this person can't be trusted. I'm often seeing multiple laws at the same time, so not just having to fight a whole series of defamation suits, for example, but having to fight a whole range of different things. So Maria, for example, has faced 13 different sets of proceedings. You've heard about Caroline facing 40 different sets of proceedings at the same time. You think about in a busy newsroom or in a small media organisation or for a freelancer, just how devastating that kind of technique is. Another technique we're seeing is states going after the heads of media organisations. So not just going after an individual journalist, for example, but going after the person who's the head of the whole organisation. And that's designed to try to knock out a whole media industry, knock out a whole newspaper, stop a whole broadcasting organisation in its tracks, and send a chilling message to the public more widely, which is keep quiet or you'll be next. So that's what's happened with Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. It's also what's happened with Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala, who founded El Periodico. So that is designed to be, with one hit, going after one person, having a devastating impact on the climate of the media in the country overall. We also see them not only targeting media organisations and journalists, but also their support network, going after families, going after their lawyers, going after civil society organisations who support them. And some examples of that would include, we've seen it very recently in Russia with Navalny, for example. We've also seen with Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala, his lawyers being prosecuted, or indeed I and Sebastian Lai and colleagues on the legal team for Jimmy Lai and Sebastian Lai have all ourselves been called enemies of the state and threatened with the long arm of the Chinese state and told we're undermining national security in Hong Kong by bringing cases to the United Nations seeking to vindicate our clients' own rights. So these are all very, very worrying techniques, and they're now systematic. So we've seen them in a wide range of countries, and they're spreading. And where they're successful, they spread further. One other trend that I wanted to flag is weaponising laws which are designed to protect journalists and support journalism. So, for example, using fake news or disinformation laws, which are often presented as supporting journalism, using them to target journalists. See the case of Serdar Akinan in Turkey, who was arrested and prosecuted for fake news, for daring to stand up and speak truth to power. And similarly, we see them trying to mobilise networks and jump on bandwagons, for example, anti-corruption, and then charging journalists with corruption, for example. So it's what I would call gaslighting on a grand scale, really. So there's some techniques that are now being used. It won't surprise you to know that it's very difficult to defend yourself against these kind of attacks, not only because you've got to face a war on multiple fronts at the same time, but also because you may just not have the tools in your armoury to fight back. So if, for example, you are a media organisation or a freelancer who over the years has developed very good relationships with defamation lawyers, for example, or you may have access to good pro bono support or low bono support from networks that deal with this kind of traditional legal threat. You may be in a very different position if you're charged with, for example, breach of a landlord and tenant obligation or tax evasion or some other kind of charge like that. So it's far, far more difficult, and often your networks aren't set up to deal with that kind of threat. So for my part, it was occurring to me over the years whilst working on these cases that actually what states are really doing with this kind of lawfare, weaponising the law, is taking some lessons from warfare, traditional warfare. Now, we've long been used to what in warfare is called the battle of annihilation, with the goal of destroying the enemy military in a single planned pivotal battle. And that's a kind of technique that has been used against journalists for many years. So trying to completely break journalists with one huge lawsuit, which is designed to break them financially and to make them think it's more hassle than it's worth to continue my work. But there are three other trends I want to flag as well. One of them is attrition warfare. Now, attrition warfare is a strategy of wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous use of personnel and material, so throwing things at the enemy. And in warfare, it's used to defeat enemies with low resources and high morale. Well, when you think of those women we were speaking about earlier, you think about Daphne Caruana Galizia, Caroline Muscat, journalists who speak truth to power despite the many risks to them. It's difficult to think of more obvious, emblematic people who have low resources but high morale. So that battle of attrition is certainly a technique that I'm now seeing used. And that's what I would describe what's happened to the shift with the freedom of information, the 40 lawsuits. That is precisely a battle of attrition. Or the disgraceful, I see Matthew came in a moment ago, the disgraceful 48 cases against Daphne Caruana Galizia at the time of her death, 43 civil, 5 criminal. That is a battle of attrition. It's designed to drain your resources, drain your morale, and distract you ultimately from doing your real job. So it's an attempt to silence through attrition. There's also a technique in warfare called decapitation, which means what it says, achieving strategic paralysis by targeting political leadership. I mentioned earlier that new aim of going after the heads of media organisations, or indeed very influential freelancers who stand alone, like Daphne Caruana Galizia. So when they go after Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala, that is using that technique from warfare. And the last one to flag is asymmetric costs, which is ensuring the cost of enemy losses or objectives is at least an order of magnitude higher than the cost of attacking. Now, when it comes to us thinking about what we need to do to fight back, I think we also need to think about asymmetric costs, because in every single case I do where a journalist is imprisoned, where a journalist faces lawfare, or where a journalist has been targeted and even killed for their work and a family is fighting for justice. In all of those cases, when deciding what you do strategically, a key aim when you're facing the state or the powerful third-party actor who's behaving in this abominable way is to think, how can you ensure that it's more hassle for that bad actor to continue acting in this way than it is for them to do the opposite? So we need to start thinking like that. And bottom line is, the enemies of press freedom are now very creative. They are using the law in creative ways. We also need to be creative. We need to start thinking about using the law in creative ways to fight back. But it's also very important that we don't just think defensively. So we don't just think about how you fight the 40 cases when they come in, how you fight the 48 cases when they come in, how you fight the various different types of legal attacks that people like Maria Ressa in the Philippines or Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong are facing. So we shouldn't just be defensive. We need to start thinking proactively about a counter strategy and a counter attack, because this is now a systematic, coordinated effort to undermine journalists and to undermine journalism. The techniques that are being used by the enemies of press freedom are clear, and today, supported by Maria and the Justice for Journalists Foundation, is a hugely important opportunity for us to think about strategizing on the other side and how we can ensure that journalists can continue to do what they do best, treading on powerful toes, speaking truth to power, putting their head above the parapet. And we as the public owe them a tremendous debt for them doing that, and we must ensure that they're supported in doing that, that these lawfare attacks stop. When these lawfare attacks happen, that they can fight back effectively. And a very simple way to do that is to ensure that we have much wider, more diverse networks of support. And I also think we need to start thinking about going after the bag carriers, so the people who often facilitate these kind of attacks, who are often not states or third-party actors themselves, but are people who stand idly by, or indeed who take instructions in cases, as some lawyers do, which are abusive methods of using the law in order to try to shut down journalists and journalism. So for all those reasons, I think lawfare is a phenomenon that we need to tackle, and I think today is a hugely important milestone in that battle.
Thank you, Keelan. Mr. Kaza. Last year, the European Commission put forward a proposal that seeks to protect journalists and activists from these abusive lawsuits, informally known as Daphne's Law. You have been a keen advocate for the need to have such protection. But we know that the Council has voted down the proposal and negotiations are ongoing. What do you think are the key elements that we need to retain?
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for these insightful contributions that we've just heard. Yes, I need to go through the story, how it all happened. And let's speak plainly. Yes, it's hard to be a journalist, especially when holding power to account is so important, but it's also very difficult and many times thankless. Also because the threats that journalists are of course facing. As we heard, journalists are not only dealing with the abuse of libel, but can be targeted on multiple fronts. And honestly, I think that this is very worrying indeed. But to go to your specific question, I will always associate SLAPPs with Daphne, because the way she was targeted was brutal, as you very well know. And I can never forget what she went through. And I also cannot forget the story about Pilatus Bank. We all remember that. And how they sent letters to all media houses in Malta the same week that she was assassinated. And I remember the impact that these letters had on our media houses, because they did take down their stories, and it was like they were rewriting history. And today we have the advantage of hindsight, and we all know that what was written about Pilatus Bank was actually true. So in this scenario, I thought that I need to do something in the European Parliament. I remember having to first start to explain what a SLAPP is. No one knew what it meant. So it was not easy for me to meet MEPs and explaining that as a European Parliament we should do something to help journalists. It is a practice that, of course, now is well understood, and we've come a very long way. So in 2017, after Daphne's assassination, we created a group of MEPs from all political groups, and it was then that we first called for a directive in 2018. At the time, responsible for this area in the Commission was Vice President Frans Timmermans. Yes, that one. And he shut it down immediately. And even though we continued our efforts, I was extremely grateful when Vice President Vera Jourova took over, because without her, we wouldn't have a text that we have today. Also, I would like to thank Roberta, my president, for her work on the subject. She was instrumental to make our proposal clearer and a concrete one. So yes, we had this media working group. We worked hard. We put as much pressure as we could on the Commission and on the European Parliament. Now, I know that the Commission went as far as it could with what it proposed. With that in mind, we have a very clear objective, that this should not be watered down, of course. Trilogue negotiations are underway, which means that Council now and Parliament are negotiating to find a compromise. I'm informed that the negotiations are difficult, of course, but let's make one thing clear. Yeah? For Council, that represents member states, it is very difficult for them to give up control. Now, I went through this time and time again. I was responsible for many dossiers in trialogue. I know how it works. But at the end of the day, even if you don't succeed under one presidency, sometimes you'd wait until another presidency because you think that the other presidency would be easier to negotiate with. So let's see how it goes. And we have a very good team. Parliament has a very good team. And I think that they are very competent on the subject. And of course, we have to secure Parliament's position, because I think Parliament's position is the best position. Now, from my point of view, we absolutely need a strong early dismissal mechanism. This is vital. This is the soul of the directive. To be honest, if we don't have this, it is much better that we shouldn't have a directive at all. This is the most important element of the directive. Then, of course, such a mechanism would be difficult for member states because it influences their judicial system at home. They are used to having, let me make it clear, both Parliament and Council agree on an early dismissal mechanism. Of course, Parliament's position is stronger and Council's position is weaker. But we'll see how this goes during negotiations. Another important element in the directive is that there should be consequences of those thinking to use a SLAPP to think twice. Of course, the directive can speak about the legal expenses that has to be considered, the damages caused to the journalist, number 2, and also the penalties that will be imposed by the court. And in Council, the text now the Council wanted to remove the damages caused. I would very much like to see this coming back into the final text. And while we are on the subject, by the way, we must never forget that these cases mostly are about reputation. A corrupt businessman or a corrupt politician, they do not want any attention. They do not want to be the subject of scrutiny. So when we were meeting before there was a draft of this directive, we thought about having an EU register to name and shame these bullies, these rich bullies. But to be honest, if it is still in Parliament's a Parliament position to have a register, but to be honest, I think sometimes public awareness in a coordinated effort between journalists, media freedom groups, and us politicians together, we can name and shame people and we can scare them just as much as they can scare journalists with the money that they have. So don't give up the fight. Let's unite together, and we will not need any register to name and shame these bullies. And I have every trust in journalists, in media freedom. I'm seeing here representatives of Republica. Thank you for the work you're doing, because even because of you, the position of journalists today is much stronger than it was ever in Malta. So this is what we need to do. Now, my closing remarks. I think that aside from this directive, policymakers need to, I myself first one, need to remain vigilant, because powerful people with a lot of money and bad intentions will go to great lengths to silence their critics. They did it to me. They did it to Jason. I'm saying Jason Atsopadi here. He was fighting a corrupt criminal bank in Bulgaria. And now, because of his work, he fought this battle alone. Because of his work, this bank is now shut down because of money laundering. We need to be ready not only to create effective legislation, but we also need to be quick to update the legislation when needed. Caroline, I finished by thanking and applauding you for your courage and for your team. The only way to deal with these bullies is to keep on fighting, and we've seen this by you and the Shift and your leaders time and time again. And only for this, you have my admiration and my continued support. And of course, we have Matthew Galicia, I saw him earlier, Mandy, Corinne, and others, like Claudette, and as I mentioned before, Republica's representatives. You are dedicated people. It's not easy. You become the target yourself. I got used to being a target, so don't worry about that. But if we remain united, we will win. We cannot fail Daphne. We have to have. I cannot fail Daphne. I promised her that I would do all in my power to see that at least no journalist will be slapped as much as Daphne was in her lifetime. So let's work together, let's remain united, and I'm pretty sure at the end we will succeed. Thank you very much.
Charlie, I'm turning to you. International organizations have been quite critical of the process in terms of the length of time. You know, politics is a game of back and forth. In the meantime, every day that we don't have this law in place is a day where journalists are at risk. Mr. Kaza raised two key issues that I think are important: early dismissal and the reversal of the burden of harm. Because when they file these cases, after we go through all of this, and even if we win, they face absolutely no consequence. So what are your views on this? And do you think we're going to get what we need?
Thank you, Caroline. I'd like to start by echoing what Maria and Keelan have already said about what a pleasure it is to be here in Malta, which really has been the epicenter of the European anti-SLAPP movement. And if I may, just very quickly give some context about CASE, the Coalition Against SLAPPs in Europe, and then I'll certainly give my impressions of what has already been said. The death of Daphne Caruana Galizia really galvanized European civil society, and ultimately, as we've heard, European politicians and decision makers to act on SLAPPs. And it's been the work of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation which has really sustained the momentum to this point and got us to the place we are now. I'd just like to start there. And also to say, we mentioned before, Roberta mentioned that the research which CASE has done. I think it's important also to highlight some of the findings there. And that is research which we continue to update and which you can find on our website, which I'll also plug here, www.the-case.eu. This research really provided the foundations of CASE by showing that a whole range of actors can be impacted by SLAPPs. Anyone who works to hold the powerful to account can find themselves victimized by SLAPPs, whether that be journalists, bloggers, activists, NGOs, whistleblowers, and so on. As a result, CASE reflects a very broad section of civil society. It is a broad and eclectic coalition of civil society organizations. And it's a coalition which is built around three different objectives. So the first objective is to advance anti-SLAPP solutions. And a really core part of that is the EU directive, which we'll be discussing today. And that's pursued in an advocacy working group. The second, and again, this is something that David mentioned as being really important, is to expose SLAPPs and those who use them. That means raising awareness, but it also means delegitimizing their use, which ultimately means naming and shaming those responsible. And that is work which is done through a campaign working group in CASE. And finally, we work to build the legal resilience of public watchdogs. So ensuring that those who are targeted by SLAPPs have all the resources and support they need to be able to fight back. I think it's fair to say in that time there have been quite a few achievements. It's worth taking a step back and reflecting where we've got to in all three of these working groups of CASE. So, for example, the legal working group has built a network of 70 lawyers across Europe who work to support public watchdogs. The campaign working group now works to name and shame offenders on a daily basis. You can see that on our Twitter feed. We have a gallery of shame which exhibits the worst offenders. We have an annual European SLAPP contest which has had between 50 and 70,000 people engaging and voting for the biggest legal bully of the year. And we have the progress we've seen on a European Union and Council of Europe level to take action on SLAPPs. CASE is now governed by a 5-member steering committee, and it's coordinated, fittingly enough, by the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. And it's really worth pausing and just appreciating that work. We've mentioned Matthew and Karina here, but also Fran, I see at the back, who works on a day-to-day basis to keep all these pieces together. And that is not an easy task. It's difficult enough to coordinate 5 people on a panel, let alone 200 people from 120 different advocacy groups, 12 different national coalitions across the entirety of Europe. It's a huge task, and it's one which has really helped get us to the point we are now. I'd say also that passion and drive has been instrumental in getting us to this point, and it's also a testament to the legacy of Daphne Caruana Galizia. But we're also conscious of the way this legacy can be eagerly but superficially championed by some politicians who lack the courage to take the meaningful steps needed to introduce meaningful reforms. And that's not to say David is very much one of the good ones here, but I think it is really important to recognize what is going on so we can call it out, what is currently going on an EU level. And I will just then directly address your question, Caroline, about where we are. So yes, there's been a lot of progress, and it is worth reflecting on three parts of the Commission's original proposed directive, which I think are particularly important. The first, as David has said, is the early dismissal mechanism, which I cannot emphasize enough is core, is central to any effective anti-SLAPP instrument. But the devil here is in the detail. It's not enough just to say that we are going to filter out abusive cases. Everyone wants to filter abusive cases out of the court process. It's how you do that. What is the threshold that claimants have to meet in order to be able to proceed to trial? And here it really comes down to this definition of manifestly unfounded. Second of all, a wide personal scope. So the directive, the draft directive of the Commission applies to all public watchdogs, all those who hold the powerful to account. And it also applies to anyone whose active public participation targets matters of public concern which are of relevance to more than one member state. And thirdly, as David has said, robust remedies, including measures such as penalties and compensatory damages, which will work to deter the use of SLAPPs. So these, in the Commission's draft directive, not perfect, but they form a framework of meaningful action. And that framework is important because it's that framework which then provides the potential for robust laws when transposed into action on a national level. And it's these three parts which are currently being threatened by members of the European EU member states. So the approach of the European Council would narrow the application of the early dismissal mechanism, rendering it unworkable in all but the most extreme cases. It would remove the availability of compensatory damages, and it would limit jurisdiction to cases where the claimant and the defendant are domiciled in different member states. As the research of cases shown, this would only apply to at most 10% of the cases that we've catalogued. So there is a long way to go. We do, however, remain hopeful that voices of those committed to progress, voices like David's, will prevail. We have to be hopeful, because it's no hyperbole to say that the future health of European democracies depends on these measures. We're also hopeful. I mean, hope also comes in the form of a Council of Europe recommendation. This is a set of standards issued by this regional human rights organization that will, I hope, shape national measures. And I think that's a good note to end on. SLAPPs are ultimately a human rights issue. It's really important to remember that. It's an issue which has implications for a range of different human rights: the right to free speech, the right to freedom of assembly and association, and other related human rights. These implications for human rights were made tragically and unavoidably clear by the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia. And we must never forget this fact. And we must never stop therefore we must never stop fighting for meaningful protections and to ensure this never happens again. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll hear from Yves, and then we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Yves, you must know, is one of the lawyers who dedicates an endless amount of her time to defending us, and it is greatly appreciated. So you can give us some insight in terms of the process here. And as Charlie said, there's a Council of Europe recommendation. And as you know, we have a Justice Minister who is saying Malta is at the forefront of anti-SLAPP legislation. So your views on this, is what is being proposed in Malta anywhere close to what we need?
No, not at all, in fact. As Charlie was saying, and to latch onto something that David was saying also, the Council of Europe, or at least the way I see it, is that where the directive may fail, I hope that the Council of Europe will triumph. So even if we don't get the measures that we want from the directive, we're hoping, and I think Charlie can sort of agree, that we're hoping to push for a more robust framework at the Council of Europe so that we can completely give the protection that needs to be given to public watchdogs. In fact, the recommendation is very much, I would say, a balance between the ideal law to have in place in the 46 member states and what we think member states will actually implement in their legal frameworks, because obviously the Council of Europe recommendation is soft law. It's not legally binding. It's more of a guideline for perhaps for states. And so we really had to find a balance between what we wish states to implement and what we think they will, sorry, I'm a bit sick, they will actually implement. So as David and both Charlie were saying, the most important instrument perhaps in targeting SLAPPs in the recommendation is the early dismissal mechanism. But again, we go maybe slightly further than the directive goes, because whilst the directive, if I'm not mistaken, only dismisses manifestly infounded cases, in the recommendation we're saying that even cases that are partially or fully unfounded, or even cases perhaps that are founded. So, for example, taking Caroline's FOI appeals, Freedom of Information appeals, they're based on law. However, the amount of appeals in a short span of time are obviously directed at draining both Caroline's energy and resources and funds and manpower to dissuade her and the rest of the SHIFT team from continuing in her quest for the truth, basically. And so at the Council of Europe, what we're trying to do is even target these sorts of SLAPPs when they could be completely founded but are abusive anyway. And how are we doing this? One of the ways in which we're doing it, and this is also where I think we differ from the directive, is that the recommendation does not give a strict definition of what a SLAPP suit looks like. So what we are trying to do is give national authorities and the judicial authorities indicators. So what could look like a SLAPP. So, for example, in the recommendation we say that if it appears that there is an abuse of an imbalance of power, so in the case, again, of these 40 Freedom of Information appeals, Caroline against 40 government departments, with all the resources, as Caroline said, about 70 lawyers, always a different one, repeating verbatim the exact same appeal, the exact same oral submissions in court, and even when being faced with our submissions that this is obviously a SLAPP, it's the exact same appeal, but they wanted to file 40, and funnily enough, the lawyer saying, no, I drafted this myself, no one gave me any instructions to do this is my own work. And even the judge sort of saying it's identical. And I recall even one time the judge reading out from a similar appeal and saying this is either plagiarism or a coordinated effort. So again, coming back to the recommendation, what we're trying to do is give national authorities, the judicial authorities, indicators. So if it appears to be abusive, if the claimant is looking for a disproportional or an unreasonable amount of damages from the public watchdog, if the claimant has chosen a jurisdiction which is, I think the wording is vexatious to to public participation, and there are a number of criteria that we are hoping are going to guide judicial authorities to identify SLAPPs at the outset. So we're hoping, if not as soon as a SLAPP suit is filed, at least when a reply to the suit or as the case starts, they can be identified as soon as possible and dismissed as soon as possible. Another, I think, very important mechanism within the recommendation, which we hope will be taken up by states, and which I believe is also in the directive, is a stay of the main proceedings whilst the decision on the dismissal is taking place. So for a journalist or for a public watchdog, it would make no sense if the claim on the merits is going to be heard and the resources would have to be put into defending that claim whilst a decision is being taken on the early dismissal. And so what we are pushing for is an automatic stay of the main proceedings whilst a decision on the early dismissal is being taken. These, I think, are really the most important mechanisms within the recommendation. Of course, as my colleagues before me have indicated, there are also mechanisms or recommendations rather to limit damages. So in Malta, perhaps this is one of the only areas in which we are perhaps at the forefront in relation to the other 46 member states, in that in Malta we have a capping on damages, at least for libel cases. Something which, by the way, across the other, from my experience at the Council of Europe, seems to be completely unheard of. And so whether that is going to be implemented or not in the rest of the member states, we're yet to see. But that is perhaps, I think, one of the only ways in which I would say that Malta and Malta's proposals are ahead of the rest of Europe. But besides this, we have the security for costs and damages, so that the public watchdog is safe in the knowledge that if the suit is declared a SLAPP suit, then they have the funds ready, damages already deposited in court or wherever in the jurisdictions, in the different jurisdictions, so that they can be covered for the damages that they have sustained. Yes, penalties for SLAPP proponents obviously is something that we're looking at also, and we will go that far to also suggest a register for SLAPP proponents for transparency, so these people can be named and shamed, because we do feel that that is a good deterrent for these people. So like I said, where maybe the directive will not go that far, we may try to go further. But also I think what's important is the support. We are recommending to states to support public watchdogs, both through the legal aid or facilitating legal aid through their different press councils, perhaps across the jurisdictions, psychological support, perhaps through the introduction of hotlines where these people who are feeling isolated and alone can call for support, even if they're feeling threatened, not only isolated. I know that Daphne in her lifetime was both isolated and threatened. And so we are also recommending that states put into place mechanisms to tackle this, whether it is by actually providing a safe haven for journalists when they feel threatened, or by helping NGOs to provide that safe haven through funding. That will be up to the states to decide. But we're also proposing financial support, so where journalists cannot actually practice their profession, basically, because of the multiple SLAPP suits perhaps that they're facing. We are hoping that states will lend a hand in some way, form or other. The exact specifics obviously will be up to the different jurisdictions, but I think what I do want to mention is that there are, within the recommendations, some suggestions which are particularly motivated by Daphne's experience, and I think Flutura here, I see her nodding, will agree. And these are most particularly the option for defendants, the option for discontinuation of proceedings on the death of the public watchdog. This is something that again was hotly discussed, and we need it. I'm glad I was there to defend it, because I think it's very important. And also the suggestion that heirs that are perhaps either forced to continue because there would not be this option to discontinue, for extra support for the heirs of a journalist or any other activist public watchdog, because they would not have been involved in the initial proceedings, or if it's a libel suit we're talking about, because they would not have written the article themselves, and so have no idea who the source is, where the info comes from, and so they find themselves, as Daphne's family unfortunately do, in a situation where they cannot defend a libel suit because they do not have the information that the journalists had. And so we are proposing that member states put into place some sort of support or some sort of leniency procedure in the judicial process, so that that can be taken into account when giving judgment on these cases. But also, I think this was also one of the things that was hotly discussed and which was motivated by one of the things that happened to Daphne. I think you will all recall that a certain businessman had filed 19 different defamation suits against Daphne on one evolving story, all about different, sometimes there were different paragraphs of the same article. And so what we're trying to do at the Council of Europe is bring about a measure which would allow states to put in place measures to make it impossible for a claimant to propose multiple defamation suits, or multiple, they don't have to be defamation suits, obviously, multiple actions based on the same facts. And that, I think, will be very helpful towards journalists. Even, for example, for the FOI requests, if they had just filed one instead of 40, I'm sure it would have saved you a lot of hassle. And so, yes, I believe those were the three, for me, most important lessons that were learned from Daphne's situation, and which we hope will be taken up by states. And just a point, sorry, just the last point, on the fact that, yes, the directive will be obviously what states will be looking to implement. We hope that states will go further, because I do believe that the directive will give states leeway to further protect if they can. We are hoping that the recommendation will allow states to do so. But more than that, we are hoping that even through time, the European Court of Human Rights will cite this recommendation, and so then national courts will cite those cases, and then there'll be a forced change in the law through the respect for human rights, which all member states are obliged to do. So even though we may take a little bit longer to get there than the EU, we're hoping that our recommendations will be taken on by all the states.
Thank you, Eve. It's a bit difficult to believe that the state is going to protect us when it's the state attacking us, but you know, hope eternal. Dr. Borges Cardona we have about 5-10 minutes because we started a bit late, so let's just try to be concise, please.
I'll take 10 seconds. My rants are usually quite short. Caroline, thanks so much with your colleagues for putting this on. It allows people like me to have a good rant. My impression is that it's going to take some time to get this on the road, or on the statute books. In the meantime, what's going to happen? My usual advice to clients, as Caroline well knows, when we get some sort of SLAPP intimation from Mishkons or from other renegade law firm, is to use the sit and swivel defense. Up yours, we're not listening. The problem with that is, if they get a judgment in default in London, Budapest, wherever, that will be enforced in Malta. Now, when my good friend Jason and myself had drafted a very brief bill and presented it to, I'm sorry to mention his name in polite company, Owen Bonnici, which basically said, listen, ignore SLAPP suits at your own risk, because if it's not a SLAPP suit, then you're basically screwed. But ignore SLAPP suits. If the foreign court tries to, sorry, the Maltese court tries to enforce it in Malta, it will be against public policy. His response to that? Sorry, we have EU obligations. They have no such obligations when it comes to defending the gaming industry, of course. No worries there. But when it comes to defending freedom of speech, freedom of information, and the rest, sorry, we can't do it because the European Union will be angry with us. Question to probably Eve and David. What are the European institutions going to do about this interim position? Are you going to tell people like, again, sorry to use his name, Owen Bonnici, where he can get off?
Let's keep our answers concise, please, because people need coffee.
Yes, of course. I don't know if David wants to answer.
Well, I'm a politician. I'm not a lawyer or a judge. So what I can tell you is this. I do hope that our judges ignore any sentences being given outside the European Union. This is what we wanted in our directive. We're going to have an EU law, and decisions taken outside the EU, if they are not compatible with the way how we are going to treat journalists, how we're going to legislate on journalists, they should just ignore any decision. Now, I'm a politician. I can say this without having any consequences, you know? But we have to defend our journalists. We cannot leave the journalists alone. And I think we have the power to do it. It's not going to take a long time. Let me tell you why. We have a problem. Next year, we have elections. So we have to have a directive agreed upon. We're trying by the end of this year. I'm informed, without saying a lot, that in a couple of weeks we should have our final trialogue. Whether this is going to be reached or achieved, I really don't know. I'm in close contact with them. If we do not have a satisfactory outcome, I would prefer to take it even to next year until we are happy with the outcome, but it has to be concluded before the next election. So in the meantime, I think you better reply to this.
Yes.
In the meantime, we have Eve, who is far more, you're more of an expert than I am on legal issues.
Again, because we don't have quite the challenges perhaps that the EU has, the Council of Europe is hoping to finalize, if I'm not mistaken, by the end of this year also, so the recommendation should be in force, Flutura reminds me, by March of next year, exactly by March next year. And so this is where you all come in actually, because we need to raise awareness about this recommendation. Yeah. So when it is in force, the best tool is awareness, education and awareness. This will empower authorities, judges, magistrates to cite this recommendation in their refusal to, for example, acknowledge a judgment, a SLAPP judgment given in another member state or in a third country. It will encourage magistrates facing libel suits to dismiss a suit, a SLAPP, even though maybe the legal framework is not quite in place. But awareness, it is coming, it is soon there, so at least until they are legally obliged to do something, the recommendation should be enforced, and it is up to all of us to raise awareness about it.
Another thing, Caroline, which I haven't mentioned is that even from the Commission, it wasn't only a directive, it is a package. We do have our own recommendations also. Now, recommendations are not going to harmonize a system. They are going to get each member state closer to each other. But governments can ignore. So yes, it is up to us to make sure that governments work and act upon, implement these recommendations. It is up to us. And we have the power to do it. For God's sake, come on. with the power of civil society and all of you, we remove Joseph Muscat from Prime Minister. So imagine we can, yes, force the government to implement a recommendation. It will be far more easier than to remove a Prime Minister in place. So please help us.
I'm just going to add something quick. It's a really important question that you've raised, and also I love the defence strategy, because, you know, just 2 points. First thing is, over a number of years, it's now been recognised that, for example, in extradition, where there's an international principle of mutual assistance, it's been recognised that in circumstances where extradition of a person is sought to a country which doesn't meet human rights standards, that extradition shouldn't proceed. So although there's this international principle about recognising other countries' judgments and respecting their systems, there's a red line when human rights are being abused. And similarly here, that same principle should apply. And you're quite right, it's really important. And I think Eve and David are quite right about the importance of the recommendation from the Council of Europe and ensuring that that can be enforced here. So ensuring that here there's awareness of it, and in all other Council of Europe countries, so that when you then have a situation where there's an attempt to enforce an abusive case from the courts in London, for example, here people can say, well, that's actually against Council of Europe policy and standards. And it should be clear that it's not just a defensive mechanism. Actually, thought should be given to proactively, potentially taking a case against the person who's trying to abuse Council of Europe standards, breaching Article 10 and so on here. But the second point in the meantime, that's a really important one, and it draws on what Charlie and Eve and David were saying earlier, is what we're dealing with here essentially is a David and Goliath battle. So the journalist is the David. I mean, everyone knows the story, David and Goliath, David fighting with the small slingshot and managing to find the much larger enemy's weak spot. And the weak spot quite often is reputation. And that's a really key issue, because quite often the very reason these cases are being brought is to try to shut down criticism. And I really am a believer in sunlight being the best disinfectant. And in many of these cases, just standing up and showing that you're going to fight the case quite often leads to it going away. There's a really powerful example. OCCRP, Paul Radu, was sued in the UK courts in London by an Azerbaijani MP when OCCRP ran a brilliant story about the Azerbaijani laundromat. And my colleague, Jonathan Price, who many of you in the room know, took on the case, acted for Paul Radu and OCCRP, and basically just looked at the whites of his eyes. And the case ended up being settled the day before. Because the bottom line was, this Azerbaijani MP wanted to be a legal bully, wanted to shut down criticism, thought the UK courts were a good way to do it, caused real problems for OCCRP trying to defend it in the UK. It was a legal threat, it was a bullying tactic, and actually standing up to the bully and showing we'll actually fight this in the court is what did it. So I think in the meantime, I agree with Eve and David, but I also think we really have to think about shining that spotlight in the way that David and Charlie were talking about earlier. And we can all do that, and we all must do that.
And you can all do that on the case website.
1 second, please. Natalie, no, I think we'll take both at the same time, and then I think we need to wrap up. Flotura, you are on the next panel, perhaps.
But I need 1 minute to thank someone, so I need 1 minute.
Okay, you can close with that. You can close with that. Because,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks also to the panel. I'm angry, and I'm very angry that we're not angry enough, actually, because we're seeing democracy dying. And many of us are not doing anything about it, or we're not doing enough about it. And I would like to take a point from what Barrister Gallagher said, and I have a question for Eve, my lawyer actually too. So when these lawyers fighting SLAPP suits are copying and pasting arguments that have been defeated, can't we report them to the Chamber of Advocates, to the Commission for Administration of Justice? I mean, these are defending lost cases. They are fighting against our right to know and being paid for our money to add insult to injury. Thank you.
Jason, we'll do the answers after. Yes, please.
That's enough now. Thank you, Caroline, for the opportunity, and congrats for the work. Our own Oriana Fallaci. I don't know why, but you remind me of her. Mela, we need this legislative intervention, not a moment too soon. May of next year, there's the parliamentary elections, the European parliamentary elections. My very brief intervention will be about the need. Natalino has implicitly referred to it, but especially David and Eve on the panel. We should, there's nothing stopping us from legislating now. And Andrew Borg-Cardona, I thank him, made this very important point about what we had proposed in 2018, 2021 as well. Mentioning SLAPP, allow me a personal reflection. It's a cruel truth that on the day of her murder, Daphne was going to the bank in view of a SLAPP court case instituted against her to shut her up by the then Economy Minister, Chris Cardona. David Casa mentioned SATA Bank. I have the dubious honor of being the first, until now the only member of parliament from a EU member state to have had a SLAPP suit filed against him in Bulgaria. The owner of SATA Bank, which was shuttered down by the European Central Bank, filed a court case against me in Bulgaria for a speech I made in Parliament. So in Malta, as in many other parliaments, there's the parliamentary immunity. This sleazeball sued me in Bulgaria for a speech I made against him in my own parliament. I got to know this in 2021. And last year, I was told that the case was decided against me. I, of course, on a point of principle, did not contest, did not file any pleas. But what I had done with the help of Andrew Borg-Cardona, before knowing, that was the irony, before knowing of this court case, because the case was filed in 2018, I got to know 2021. In 2017/18, I filed with the help of Andrew Borg-Cardona, I thank him tremendously, a very simple private member's bill to stop the execution in Malta of any SLAPP decided abroad against a Maltese-based publication or Maltese-based journalist. Maltese government had said that it goes against EU law. David Casa, and I thank him because he was the only high-ranking Maltese politician to stand up and stick out his neck for me when I was being sued in Bulgaria. David Casa asked Vera Jourova, and the commissioner told him in a parliamentary question that no, it's not true. There is nothing in EU law stopping a government having sovereignty to decide to protect its own citizens. So it all boils down to, why can't we have the unity of resolve and fortitude to exert pressure? David is right. 2019, we managed to do the impossible and the unthinkable together as a country, as a civil society, to force government to make this most important civil liberty enforceable. There is no greater civil liberty than the liberty to the press, to freely investigate, and to government critics to freely criticize government. That is the greatest civil liberty of all. And so let it be known that the Maltese government, yesterday, the day before, today, tomorrow, can freely legislate to stop lawsuits against Maltese journalists. But it is deliberately, intentionally avoiding such a legislative intervention, as it refused to help and defend Daphne from the lawsuits and the SLAPP actions she was facing, precisely because it wants them not to investigate it. And hopefully we'll soon, not in the very far future, will know why it was important for journalists, for Daphne, to freely investigate certain big corruption stories. So I conclude on this point. Let us agree that yes, the European Parliament and the European institutions have their own responsibilities. But our government has a duty, and we have a right to expect our government to enforce that duty towards us, to protect journalists from SLAPP lawsuits. There is nothing stopping it, neither in the Constitution or in the law. So why? The Maltese government protects hunters more than it protects our journalists. The Maltese government, at the cost of breaching EU law, protects Maltese hunters. But it does not protect just as much Maltese journalists. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think we'll hand the mic to Flutura. Kevin? Okay, going the other way. And I think we can continue the conversation off stage because then it's unfair and I really need coffee and this thing is piercing my ear. Ma niflaħx iktar.
Hi, very briefly, my name is Flutura Kosari. I'm the legal advisor of the European Center for Press and Media Freedom. I just want to use the opportunity that I'm in Malta to thank at least 3 people who have been very supportive on the anti-SLAPP work. First and foremost, David Casa is the first politician at the European level asking the Commission to come up with anti-SLAPP legislation. This was 6 months after Daphne was assassinated. Thank you very much, David. Secondly, Eve is a member of the anti-SLAPP expert committee at Council of Europe level. If the recommendation is passed as it is, we'll have at least 3 provisions which are a very strong support for protection for journalists. And these are provisions that Eve has proposed based on Malta experience. Thank you very much, Eve.
Thank you, Eve.
And this is my final. I want to thank Teresa Comodini. I don't know if she's here.
Yes, she's up there.
She is very helpful to us. Every time something happens in Malta in terms of legislative changes, we go to her, we ask for analysis. She's very quick. Thank you very much. It feels great to have such partners. Thank you.
Okay, we'll close this here. Let's have some coffee.